Thank you very much, Rose, for reading for us. Please keep Jeremiah chapter 32 open, and you'll see space for your notes. I'm afraid there's not an outline, but there's space for your notes on the back of the notice sheet also. Let me ask you this Sunday about your investment portfolio. I guess most of us have made some kind of investments with our money, whether that's just a few pounds in the piggy bank, or whether we've opened a bank account, or whether we have a pension fund, or whether we've invested in property. I guess that's often in our day and age, that's the place where we look to invest most of our money. What kind of property did you invest in then? I remember a friend who's a investment banker explained to me a few years ago he had bought property in Germany because he wasn't sure how the euro was going to do, and so Germany had some sort of exposure to that currency market. But even if the euro failed, he thought the wealth of Germany will be secure in property. I don't know, I think that's an investment tip several years old, so it's probably not any use now. Or maybe you've invested in property in London. I've recently jointly bought a house with some friends on the edge of the Stratford boom, and we're hoping that on the coattails of the Olympic development, it will be a secure investment for the future. I wonder if you've made investments in this world, pension funds, property, bank accounts, shares, or whatever. Well, in some ways, this chapter of Jeremiah is about an investment. Jeremiah is told to buy a field, and much of the whole chapter is about this very extraordinary and seemingly unwise investment. Now, of course, it's not as simple as saying in the Bible, Jeremiah buys a field, therefore you should buy a field. And that's not going to be the message today, and it's not how to read the Bible very sensibly. Anyway, you can do some pretty crazy things in Jeremiah if you just copy what he does. But actually, I think in a sense, this is a chapter about our investments, because it's a chapter about the action that Jeremiah takes in the present because of what he believes about the future. In his case, it's to make an investment, which we'll look at in some detail. And I think it is valid, therefore, to ask the same sort of question of us. God's made various amazing promises about the future. And if we believe them, what concrete action will we take in the present to show that we invest in those promises being true? Now, in Jeremiah's case, this is a financial investment. It costs him 17 shekels of silver, verse 9. And I guess for us, it may be financial. Jesus himself said that what we do with our money is an indicator of where our hearts are and where our trust is and where our hopes are found. But actually, it'll be wider than that. It will affect what we do with our time, the relationships we make, the way that we behave in this world. What difference will be made in the present if you believe in God's promises for the future? Will you invest in the future? Now, actually, this investment that Jeremiah makes he's almost forced into it, actually. So he's in prison. We read at the beginning of the chapter. Chapter 32, verse 3, Zedekiah had imprisoned him because he didn't like his sermons. And along to visit him in prison comes his uncle. And, what will he bring him? Maybe a cake or maybe some warm clothes or something like that. But no, instead, his uncle's obviously fallen on difficult times. And he says, you've got to buy my field off me. It said in the Old Testament law in the book of Leviticus that if a family member became poor and was going into debt, then you were obliged to buy from them some of their assets. They didn't have to go to the pawnbroker. They just went to a family member and you had to give them the cash that they needed. So obviously Shalom, the uncle of Jeremiah, is in some kind of difficulty. He needs some money. And so rather insensitively, he goes up on prison visiting hours to Jeremiah and says, that field of mine, please buy it. I need the cash. And it has to be said, it is a pretty terrible investment. So the year is probably 587, 588 BC. It's the year that the city of Jerusalem will finally fall to the Babylonians. In fact, we find out later in the chapter in verse 24 that the siege ramps are already in place. So let's just set the scene. Imagine you're doing a helicopter fly past with CNN, and this is you're covering the special Judah story. And as you hover across the whole of the land of Judah, you see that the fields have been burnt to the ground, farms have been destroyed by the marauding Babylonian armies. They've swept through the whole land. But Jerusalem is still standing as a city, except that all around it is the Babylonian army, and the siege ramps are laid to it. And then you zoom in, and in the middle of Jerusalem you can see this prison cell, and there is Jeremiah's uncle urging him to buy a field. The field is in Ananoth, which is where Jeremiah's from. We find out at the beginning of the book his own part of the country in the tribal lands of Benjamin. In other words, Ananoth is probably one of the places already overrun by Babylonians. They're going to overpower it. They're going to destroy it. It is a terrible investment, isn't it? It's like someone, I don't know, imagine someone in 1939 asking if you want to invest land in Poland just as the German tanks advance. It's not going to be a very safe investment. In fact, one of the commentators puts it like this: as we think about the political, military, and theological circumstances, this offer is not one that should be accepted. There we are, that's his investment advice. It is a crazy investment. Invest in a bit of land, probably already overtaken, if not imminently going to be overtaken, by a hostile power, that you yourself, Jeremiah, have prophesied will be under enemy rule for 70 years, so it's going to outlast you, and you've been asked to buy a plot for your retirement there. I mean, it's a ridiculous decision, actually, to do it. But he does because of the promises that he knows God has made. I was a bit sad not to get Jeremiah 31, which was last week's passage. If you missed it, please download the sermon from the internet. It was a fantastic message. David Jackman's final sermon, and a wonderful final sermon to preach. And I thought, well, that's obviously the jewel in the crown. That's the climax. So chapter 31 is the climax. Does that make chapter 32 the anti-climax? Well, I don't think so. Actually, I think Jeremiah 32 is going to piggyback on the climax. Jeremiah 32 is exciting because Jeremiah 31 is exciting. In fact, it comes sandwiched in between the two most positive parts of the book. Jeremiah 31, very positive. Jeremiah 33, which we won't have a sermon on, sadly, this series, but wonderfully positive. And in the middle comes Jeremiah 32. And I think the point is, as I've said, Jeremiah 32 shows us the action that makes sense in the present, given God's promises about the future. What I want to do in this sermon is to remind you what was so good about chapter 31, and tell you a couple of things about what's so good about chapter 33, and then look at the action in the middle that makes sense in light of those promises. Chapter 31 was great because God promised to fix the problem that had been the downfall of the country all the way through the book. If you've been here for the whole series, you'll know we've had 8 sermons, and 6 of them have been pretty gloomy. So if you've just joined us today, you've missed the bad news. But for most of Jeremiah has preached God's judgment against a people who had abandoned their God. It was a message of woe, a message of imminent destruction. And again, Jeremiah puts his finger on the problem. He says it's on the inside. These people have stubborn hearts. That phrase, stubbornness of heart, comes again and again. Chapter 3:17, 7:24, 9:14, 11:8, 13:10, 16:12, 18:12, 23:17, all the way through this same phrase, the stubbornness of your heart. But then in Jeremiah 31, that very negative strand about the problem of the human heart gets fixed. And God says that he will make a new covenant with his people. And chapter 31, 33, I will put my law within them and I will write it on their hearts. The problem was the heart. It was just intrinsically predisposed to idolatry, to making fake gods, not just externally but internally, worshipping in everything and everyone other than the true God. The heart was predisposed intrinsically to deafness to God's word. It wouldn't listen. Jeremiah kept preaching, and afterwards people forgot his sermons or hated his sermons or tore up his sermons or threw the preacher in prison. I'm not looking forward to question time, but I think I'll do better than Jeremiah did, if you're feeling more charitable than that. They would not listen. But now God will change the heart so that they will worship him, so they'll listen to him, so they will know him. That's a wonderful strand, chapter 31. And it's all bound up with forgiveness. Chapter 31, verse 34, I will forgive their sins, I'll remember their sin no more. And it's all bound up with promise, a covenant, a promise that God will make. So, very positive chapter. God says, I'll fix the problem, I'll change your heart, I promise to do it, and I'm going to forgive you. That's the chapter 31 strand. Chapter 33 also pulls together a negative theme that's gone all the way through the book and then turns it positive. So we saw heart was a negative theme that became positive in chapter 31. Well, marriage is a negative theme that becomes positive. Well, not negative because marriage is negative, but it's negative because marriages aren't going to happen. Or at least happy marriages aren't going to happen. Because the land's going to be under siege and under judgment in exile. And Jeremiah said, chapter 7, I will silence in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, because the land shall become a waste. Chapter 16, he said, I will silence in this place before your eyes and in your days the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride. Chapter 25, I will banish from them the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride. No one's going to be celebrating, in other words. Just a way of capturing how devastating God's judgment will be. There'll be no weddings or anything happy like that, says Jeremiah. But then in Jeremiah chapter 33, God says, the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the voices of those who sing, will sing, saying, give thanks to the Lord of hosts, the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever. For I will restore the fortunes of the land as at first, says the Lord. Weddings again. And just like in chapter 31, it turns out this will be because of forgiveness. 33:8, I'll cleanse them from the guilt of their sin against me, and I will forgive the guilt of their sin and rebellion against me. And just like in chapter 31, it turns out to be bound up with promise, with a covenant that he makes. So we haven't got time to go into it all in detail, but do you see that there's these two strands where the grim message of Jeremiah suddenly turns into good news? The heart that was the cause of stubbornness and rebellion now becomes a changed heart. The weddings that couldn't happen suddenly becomes loads of weddings, loads of celebration. And all because of a promise about forgiveness. So chapter 31, chapter 33, they belong together, lots of themes in common. And then in between, this bizarre instruction to buy a field. Buy a field in enemy territory. Buy a field that won't be liberated within your lifetime. It will be 70 years under Babylonian age. But nonetheless, go ahead and buy it. Why does Jeremiah make this crazy investment in a far-off promise? Michael Yu, he's just sitting down there, I think he's PhDs in some sort of sciencey, physicsy thing. Is that right, Michael? Yes, it is. And that means that, like me, he finds graphs easier to understand sometimes than words. And if you've done the Bible overview with Michael, you'll know that it's full of graphs. And I can't remember the graphs in detail, but I do remember that Michael has a graph that contrasts the experience of God's people with what's promised to God's people. And as the experience of God's people gets worse and worse and worse, what's promised to God's people gets better and better and better. And I suppose this is really the zenith of promise and the nadir of experience. And the graphs are at their maximum separation because things are really awful. The Babylonians are around the walls of the city, besieging it. Jeremiah the prophet is in prison, being ignored by the king. He's about to go into exile. Everything is looking awful. And God's promises are amazing. A new covenant, forgiveness, weddings and marriages, liberation. Everything is looking rosy. I don't know what your reaction to that is, but mine is to say, well, of course, that is what you say, isn't it? I mean, if the reality is grim, why not just fantasize about something better? It's probably what our non-Christian friends think about the Christian, don't they? They say, look, you saw the figures last week in the newspapers that for the first time officially Christianity is a minority religion in the UK. I mean, actually, it's probably been a minority religion really for some time. But for the first time, people who identify as Christian is now beaten by people who identify as secular or atheist. We're in a minority. And so they say, well, obviously, what you do when the actual reality of the church is so bad is you substitute it with fantasies. And you say, well, I'm dreaming of it being better. I'm hoping for it to be better. Or even, God's promised it to be better. And your atheist friend says, oh, I bet he has, yeah. Wishful thinking, that contrasts completely with the hard reality. Surely that's what religion's all about. That's what Jeremiah's all about. The reality is super grim. The promises are super brilliant. So God says, well, on the basis of these promises, why not buy this field in crazy optimism about the future? Actually, I think we'll find that Jeremiah has got 3 good reasons. Well, actually, he's got 2 reasons and we've got a third. There are 3 good reasons for investing in the future, as Jeremiah does. By the way, that doesn't mean that you literally should make real estate purchases in the Middle East. As we read the whole of the Bible, it becomes clear that God's promises are no longer geopolitical about this little bit of land in Benjamin called Ashtaroth, if you could find it, or about the Holy Land in general. But God's promises are now much bigger. They're about a whole new heaven and a new earth. Jesus speaks about storing up treasure not in real estate in Jerusalem, but in heaven. So that's the application we're thinking about. But 3 good reasons why that seemingly wishful thinking, pie in the sky, crazily optimistic investment is worth it, even in the midst of the harsh reality of decline in the present. First reason is God has proved his faithfulness by what he's said. There's a pattern in Jeremiah that God says something and then it happens. And in our chapter, that happens in the big level and in the very small level. So it happens in the big level because God has made a prediction through Jeremiah that they're going to fall to the Babylonians. And it is about to happen. In fact, it will happen later this same year. Might even happen in a matter of weeks, because here are the siege ramps already. But actually, one of the ways you know God can be trusted is he said in advance that it would happen before it happens. And then when it happens, with the benefit of hindsight, you say, yeah, God was right. We can trust what he says. Actually, by this stage, I think it's becoming pretty obvious that Jeremiah's right. It's obvious to everyone apart from the king. So look at the beginning of chapter 32. Chapter 32, verse 2. At that time, the army of the king of Babylon was besieging Jerusalem. So the attack is currently happening. And Jeremiah the prophet was shut up in the court of the guard that was in the palace of the king of Judah. Why? Because Zedekiah, the king of Judah, had imprisoned him, saying, "Why do you prophesy and say, 'Thus says the Lord, I'm giving this city into the hand of Babylon, and he shall capture it'?" I mean, it's almost a laughable scene, right? So here is Jeremiah in prison for saying that Jerusalem will fall to the Babylonians. The king says this is a ridiculous and very unwelcome message. And at the same time as he's in prison, the Babylonians are at the gates, besieging it. Now, your ridiculous sermon about the fall of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, they're actually there, this huge army. Seeming pretty obvious by this stage. It's become increasingly obvious. We're told that Jeremiah prophesied during the reign of 3 different kings. This is the last one. So it started off by just a distant threat. God says you're going to be in trouble with Babylon. Who's Babylon? Just this unknown superpower that hasn't even arisen yet. Who's Babylon? Or Babylon is the superpower that now has arisen and has besieged much of your country. Who's Babylon? Babylon's the one that if you get your binoculars out, you'll see on the horizon. Who's Babylon? Babylon's the one that you don't even need binoculars anymore. Just look out the window. There they are. It becomes increasingly obvious, and it's about to be proven true. And the city will fall just as God said. You see, God's got a track record of getting things right. That's the big example in Jeremiah, but then you get a little miniature example in verse 6. Jeremiah said, "The word of the Lord came to me. Behold, Hanamel, son of Shalom, your uncle, will turn up, prison visiting hours, and say, 'Buy my field.' Then Hanamel, my cousin, came to me in accordance with the word of the Lord and said to me, 'Buy my field.' Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord." You see, you get it in miniature. It's almost comedy. Jeremiah gets a prophecy saying, "Expect your uncle any time now," asking you to help him out. And then, "Oh, who's that? Oh, it's Jeremiah's uncle. You know, oh, I've been expecting you." And I knew it was the word of the Lord. How did he know? Because it came true. So it's not as if God is saying to us or to Jeremiah, "Look, just take my word for it about a pie-in-the-sky promise. One day there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. One day Jesus is going to return and he will reign. One day the Christian faith that looks like it's, certainly in the West anyway, it's diminishing. One day the Christian faith will be proved right and vindicated." You go, really? Optimism, wishful thinking? No. No, it's the promise of a God who again and again and again has proved his track record. He says it, and it happens. And that's clear in the little miniature comedy example of his uncle turning up, and it's true in the huge natural example, instance of the army turning up. So first reason, God has said it and been proved right. Second reason, it's pretty similar to this, but God has done it. So it's not just a matter of God saying things, but God acting unmistakably to save people. After he buys this field, he does what God told him to do, he sort of has doubts about it. So look on at chapter 32, verse 16. "After I had given the deed of purchase to Baruch, son of Neriah, I prayed to the Lord, saying, 'Ah, Lord God, it's you that's made the heavens and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you.'" Sounds like a faithful prayer, but you sort of wonder whether he's trying to convince himself. God, you made the world, and that was pretty powerful, and nothing's too difficult for you, is it? And then you get to the end of the prayer, chapter 32, verse 25. "Yet you, O Lord God, have said to me, 'Buy the field for money and get witnesses,' though the city is given into the hands of the Chaldeans." See, I'm sure you can do everything, but really? You want me to invest in this crazy way in the future? But he's strengthened by the knowledge that God has acted before. So he brings to mind the Exodus under Moses, when God, with strong hand and outstretched arm, took their forefathers to to the land he promised to give them, a land flowing with milk and honey. He remembers the conquest of the promised land filled with the Canaanites. They entered and they took possession of it. Lord, nothing's too difficult for you. I've seen you do it before. I remember hearing about the water of the Red Sea parting. I remember hearing about the Egyptian army drowning in their pursuit. I remember hearing about the walls of Jericho falling when they marched around them. Lord, you've done it before. Nothing's too difficult for you, is it? And then God replies, verse 26, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me? So he asked Jeremiah the same question. Really? Just do the logic of it. Let's think of some of the things I've done before. Made a universe. Tick. Messed with the laws of nature. Check. Rescued people. Check. Kept my promises to them. Check. So yeah, buy a field, Jeremiah. Because fields will again be bought and sold in this land. The land I promised you. So the reason of what God said, the reason of what God's done, and then thirdly, and this is really a reason for us more than even for Jeremiah, the reason of what God will do. Because as New Testament reads of Jeremiah, we have the benefit of even more hindsight than he had. Excuse me, sorry. Jeremiah has some hindsight. He can look back on the Exodus and it happened. He can look back at the promise about the besieging Babylonian army and it happened. He can look back at the promise that his uncle would turn up and ask him to buy a field and it happened. So he's got some hindsight, but we've got even more. God promised a new covenant when he would forgive their sins. And it happened. God promised a new covenant, chapter 33, when his king would sit on the throne. And it happened. And so much of Jeremiah is actually fulfilled. We've seen this over the whole series. It's fulfilled in the person of Jesus. I was quite shocked, actually, when we were planning the series, to find how many bits of Jeremiah we could find being quoted. I think we've had almost one a week, and we still haven't run out of New Testament passages. There's even more bits of Jeremiah that we haven't been able to do, that the New Testament quotes. And I want to finish, this is slightly risky before question time, so I'm going to preempt this last bit of the sermon by saying, I only understand as much as I'm about to say now. So don't bother asking any questions about this last bit, because this is the limit of my understanding. But very strangely, it seems that Jeremiah chapter 32 gets quoted in Matthew, or at least alluded to in Matthew, with respect to a field that the Pharisees buy with the proceeds of Judas Iscariot's betrayal. So that was our first reading. Maybe you can turn just back to it as we close. Matthew chapter 27. It is quite tricky, this, so maybe an unwise final point for a sermon, but there we are. So Judas has betrayed Jesus for money. He then has a crisis of conscience and wants to give back the money. And the chief priests say, well, it's no use to us anymore because it's blood money, it's dirty. We can't put it into the treasury. But instead, verse 7, they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Well, here's where it gets tricky. That doesn't come from Jeremiah, at least not directly. In Jeremiah, he pays 17 pieces of silver for a field, and here it's 30 pieces of silver. Jeremiah, there's no reference to the field belonging to a potter, but here in Matthew it speaks about the potter's field. It turns out, though, there is a prophecy in Zechariah about Zechariah the prophet giving 30 pieces of silver, so right amount of silver, to the potter, right person. Okay, so first instance, you think, has Matthew just made a mistake and written Jeremiah when he should have written Zechariah? Well, no, actually, because not everything fits Zechariah either, because in Zechariah, there is no field. It's just 30 pieces of silver given to a potter. It's only when somehow you combine a little bit of Zechariah with a bit of Jeremiah that you come up with all the elements you need for the fulfillment in Matthew 27. Now that shouldn't really trouble us because it's just the way in which rabbis often used to work. They combine different bits of prophecies and put them together. There's another example, more famous one in the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Mark says, as it's written in Isaiah the prophet, and then he gives you a bit of Isaiah the prophet and a bit of Malachi the prophet combined. So it's a kind of common practice in those days to see these composite fragments of God's promises building up into a bigger picture. So, okay, it's a bit of Zechariah, 30 pieces of silver and a potter, and a bit of Jeremiah buying a field. Put them together. What have you got? Matthew 27. But then the parallels are still a bit tricky, aren't they? Because Jeremiah buys a field in faith, trusting in God's promises. But in Matthew, the chief priests buy a field cynically because they've just sponsored a murder. The parallels aren't very obviously direct. And so I've looked in various commentaries, they all say, oh, this is a tricky one, and then they opt out of it. One person even says, oh, maybe it's not Jeremiah 32 at all, maybe it's Jeremiah 18, because that's about a potter. Yeah, it is about a potter, but there's no piece of silver and there's no field, so I don't think that really solves your problems either. But actually, when you think about it, you start to see there are quite a lot of parallels, aren't there? This is money for a redemption price, says Jeremiah, buying it off his uncle. This is money that secures something about the future, God's promises for the new creation. This is promises fulfilled in a very costly price, prayed for a very wonderful future. You say, well, I think it does fit. Not exactly parallel in every way, it's partly contrasting. But here is money that is paid for investment in God's promises. But the price turns out to be ultimately the price of Jesus' death. Now, whether I got that right, I don't know. As I say, that's as much as I understand. But certainly it's true that these promises of Jeremiah in general are fulfilled in Jesus' death. In fact, Jeremiah 31 that David Chapman got last week is quoted again and again and again in the New Testament and applied to Jesus' death. Why should you invest in God's future? Well, one, because God's track record of promising things that come true is very impressive. He says it, it happens. Secondly, God's track record of doing things, at least even up to Jeremiah's time, is pretty impressive. He's made a universe, he's saved a people, he's destroyed a city. And then thirdly, for us, with the benefit of even more hindsight, God's promises have been fulfilled in so many ways in the Lord Jesus. His death pays the price that buys a future. So I want to return to the question we began with. Will you buy the field? I don't mean literally in the Middle East. I mean, will you make the investment in what God's promised in the future, even though to the world around us it looks like a very risky and stupid investment? Oh, the Church of England's on the decline, they say. Oh, there's not as many Christians in the UK anymore as there were. We can do the maths and the extrapolation, and there'll be almost none in 100 years' time, so they think. What a crazy thing to give your money to the gospel, to invest your life and your time in the gospel, particularly if it started to cost you resources that you could be using in other ways. Time that you could invest in your career ladder or in your popularity, and instead you back the horse that looks like it's doomed to lose. Why? Because God told us to. Invest your money, your time, your resources in his kingdom. Jesus says, seek first his kingdom. Why? Because he told you to. And we've every reason to trust his promise. What he says comes true. He's done it before. And in the Lord Jesus, he does it ultimately. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this amazing book of Jeremiah that we've enjoyed over this last 8 weeks or so. And we pray, Lord, that as we come to the happy bit at the end, we would put it into action. Thank you that Jeremiah doesn't just hear about promises or make promises, but he acts on them. And thank you, Father, that he did by that field, that he trusted you even as he doubted and struggled. Thank you for his reasoning that you are the Lord, the God of all. Is anything too difficult for you? And Father, we pray that the same logic will be at work in our minds, that we realise that you can be trusted, that nothing is too difficult, and therefore that we make the investment in the future that you've promised. For Jesus' sake, amen.
Well, we'll take a break for 1 or 2 minutes. If you have a question written down already, you might want to tear that out now and pass it to the end of the row. Otherwise, please get writing, and the stewards will run down and collect those, and we'll start in just about 3 minutes. I think keep writing for now if there are any more, and we'll see how many we get through. I'm going to start with the ones we have, or at least the ones I've read so far. First one, so Jeremiah, we think, was guilty of insider trading. I'm not sure that one wants an answer. There are at least 2 here about prophecy today, so I guess not the Jeremiah situation. What do we do? Does God still speak to us through prophecy? As an example via Bible verses, etc. What about people who say they predicted the financial crash of 2008? Are they the same as Jeremiah? Should we treat them the same?
Thank you. I mean, the simple answer, does God still speak to us today in prophecy, is yes, he speaks to us in this prophecy. So the Bible contains promises, some of which have been fulfilled and others of which await their fulfillment. And we are being invited to stake our life on these prophecies. So as Christians, we are people who believe in prophecy. Things that God has said about the future, he will do. But the apostles in the New Testament are clear that this is the place that we look to find God's definitive promises. And that prophets like Jeremiah we're not to expect anymore. In fact, a great place to look for that is the book of 2 Peter, where I think William's been preaching on Sunday afternoon, Sunday evenings. And Peter says that as he's about to die, he wants the people of his generation to remember the things that he said. And let me just find the verse. 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter, his last words, pretty much, his final letter, he wants them to remember the predictions of the holy prophets and the commandment of the Lord and Saviour through the apostles. So the pair is the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles of the New Testament. And Peter's advice to us now is remember. So he doesn't say we got tuned in, we heard God speak, you tune in and you hear God speak as well. He says we tuned in and heard God speak, the prophets, the apostles. Now remember, stick with what we've said and keep believing it.
Thank you. There's one bundle of what I think we mainly want to get to, because that will most help us talk together. We've got a couple here about, and there's one more creeping in, that's very good. We've got a couple here about the whole book. So I wonder, Andrew, can you very briefly answer these so we have time for the other ones? One is Jeremiah a symbol of us, Christians, or is he the wider church, or is he Jesus? So as we read it, what do we make of him, the character? And then the other one says, Jeremiah is long and hard to get a handle on. Thank you, Andrew, for teaching us from it. Could you remind us again of its structure and suggest how we should continue to read it in order to understand it better? So 2 aimed at going on reading it, which I hope we will do.
Thank you. So one of those is what's the structure? The other one is
how do we
who is
regard
he?
Jeremiah
himself? They're actually both quite difficult questions. I'll try and do them quickly. We rightly say with the Old Testament that we mustn't too quickly jump into someone's shoes. So we shouldn't read the story of David and think, I am David, because he was the unique king of Israel, and I'm not. We shouldn't read Moses and think, I am Moses, because he is the unique rescuer with an amazing walking stick that could part water, and you can't. So don't immediately identify with a character. Having said that, sometimes the New Testament does say you're a bit like David. He prayed Psalm 32, you need to pray Psalm 32. Or sometimes it says you are a bit like Moses. So Moses was a man of faith, and you are supposed to be people of faith, Hebrews 11. So actually the question of how much do I correspond to this particular Old Testament character is often a nuanced one. Don't assume you are that character in every possible respect, but you might be like that character in other respects. So Jeremiah, he's a prophet. I'm not a prophet. He's the one that brings God's promises for the first time ever to the world, and I don't do that. But he's also a believer in God in hostile circumstances, and I guess we're some of those. He's someone whose words are not always accepted by those around them and suffers persecution for that, and to some extent we do that as well. So you just got to ask the question, to what extent am I like him in these different respects? I think there's not a blanket answer. It needs to be a nuanced answer. The structure of the book is really quite difficult. And William said to me actually a few weeks ago, have you cracked the structure of Jeremiah? And I said, no. But I've looked at lots of commentaries and neither have they. And it is very difficult. And it might be, this isn't heretical to say, it might just not be a book that is so intricately structured. So it's a book where every part is needed and where it's been put together under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But it's not necessarily, you can't treat Jeremiah as if it were one of Paul's letters where he works the logical argument for beginning, middle and end. And books of the Bible work differently like that. And certainly it's not chronological, so he gives a few date markers through the book and they're not in order. And sometimes he's in prison and the next chapter he's not in prison. So it doesn't seem to be organised chronologically, nor is it necessarily arranged in a sort of simple progression. Bad news, good news. The good news comes in the middle, chapter 31 to 33, and then it gets bad again and seems to flash back in time. So I think the only thing I would say by way of structure is I think that in chapter 1, a good theme sentence for the book comes in verse 10. Chapter 1, verse 10, I've set you this day over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. There's two sides to it. Jeremiah's work is destructive, root out and destroy the fake idolatrous religion, and then to plant, it's constructive, replace it with the real thing. And I'm confirmed in thinking that is the key verse because it comes again in the climax chapter 31, where just before the wonderful passage we heard last week, God says to Jeremiah, it shall come to pass that as I've watched over them to pluck up and break down, to overthrow and destroy and bring harm, so I will watch over them to build and to plant, says the Lord. So I think you could say the grim bits are to break down, the happy bits are to build.
Thank you. Good. Then we have two main questions, I think. And I wonder if I want to suggest that as I read them out, you choose which one you will keep talking to your neighbour about, if you'd like to do that. So I think two very good questions of exactly the kind of thing we could keep talking together about. I may need to give a little bit of background to one of them. So one of them says, how do we get the right balance between seeking the welfare of the place we are here, chapter 29, and investing in the eternal new creation? And that question goes with another question that asks for help applying Old Testament prophecy, saying how is it that when we see a promise like seek the prosperity of the city, we say still true for us, and when we see buy a field, we say not the same for us. So I want you may need to say a little bit about chapter 29 and then tell us how we strike a balance between those two.
Thank you. Well, I think I am saying true for us, in that biofuel is true for us. It doesn't mean specifically get real estate in the Middle East. But it does mean, just as Jeremiah is told to invest in the future and in God's promised future, so we should do the same. I think that does apply to us. And similarly, chapter 29, just as Jeremiah is told, you're going to be here for quite a long time in Babylon, so get on with life there and work for the prosperity of Babylon. That's also true for us. So I think they're both true for us. The question is how they fit together. And I think David Jackman's sermon was very helpful on chapter 29 and worth listening to. Basically, the issue for Jeremiah is he's saying you're going to be going into exile for 70 years. And the false prophets are either saying you won't go into exile at all, and then as it becomes increasingly obvious that they will, they go, you're just going to exile for a few years, maybe 3 years, one of them says. And Jeremiah's saying, no, it's going to be long enough that you've got to face the reality of life in exile. It's not just a passing, quick phase. And that's true of the Christian as well. So some people perhaps misunderstood Jesus' words of saying he's going to come back so quickly that they didn't need to bother to get jobs or anything. So in Thessalonians, there's a hint of that. They've become lazy because they think Jesus will be back any time now, so I don't even need to bother with all the faff of going to work or anything. I'll just wait for Jesus to return. And that's wrong. Jesus will be a while, we'll be in the world for a while, and you've got to reckon on a long stay. That will mean being in the world, having relationships with people in the world, going to work in the world, etc., etc. So that is true of us. But actually, interestingly, even in chapter 29, where Jeremiah says, work for the prosperity of the city where you're going into exile, even in that chapter he says, because in 70 years I'm going to rescue you and restore your prosperity in the land. So even the sort of living in the world bit is meant to be shaped by the promise of the future when we're back with God in his place. And I think that therein lies the balance between the two. It's not, should I, go about my job at work, or should I invest in heaven? It's both, but in this way, be involved in your job in such a way as you're looking forward to the new creation. You'll be here for a while. You'll probably be here at work for a long time. I remember, in jest, we used to pray for Jesus' return at key times, like just before exams. I remember thinking, this would be a good time. I know you can go back any time, but how about now? And it might be after exams, so you have to do some revision. And it might be after a life at work, so you have to do some work. But get on with it in this world with an eye to our permanent home. And the phrase that the New Testament uses, particularly in 1 Peter, very helpful, is it calls us strangers or sojourners in the world. Now you've got to get on with it as you sojourn. You'll have to work for unjust bosses. You'll have to be in a difficult society that might persecute you. You've got to live in a godly way in this world. But remember that after a little while, you're going to a future promised home.
Thank you. I'll read you the second question. We may need to leave it there. The 2 Peter 3 that we looked at all through the service is also very helpful because it shares with Jeremiah 29 the sense that where you live now is going to be destroyed. So obviously the future matters more. And I think the ideal thing we could do by talking together is help each other work those out in practice. So if you have recently had young children and you're trying to work out how much of your time and resources should go into young children here on earth and what they need, well, there's people in the room whose children are in their 20s and 30s who worked out those decisions throughout their lifetime. So talking together about how we apply this could be very helpful. So one question I was recommending, how do we get the right balance between now and then? The second question I'm not going to ask Andrew, but you might want to use with your neighbour, do we fudge it by investing in this world and in the next? So depending how strong your neighbour is looking, you might want to choose one of those two. Andrew, thank you very much. We're going to finish by singing, and our final song, the final verse, asks God to finish the new creation on the day when he makes us finally pure and sinless in heaven. So please would you stand for our final hymn.